Yeah, hi there. I'm taking a look at your summary right now that you sent me, I think, Tuesday. So, Deborah Tannen is, I'm going to make just a few small corrections. I'm going to put A because scholar is a singular count noun who says, don't forget that determiner, her marriage broke up because of a basic failure of communication. She wants to illustrate why women's, put apostrophe S, conversation is a cross cultural communication, and we'll put long-term relationships. Therefore, she wants to describe some of the characteristics of the different worlds within which they live. Good. Wow, I love that. Within which they live within. Very formal grammar there. First, Tannen tries to explain the differences in conversations between men and women. This part, I wouldn't. Who's using meta messages? Yeah, let's just, you talk about it later, right? Men and women have exactly different styles of conversation. She says that. I wouldn't use even though here because you need to have a dependent and independent clause. I think she says that boys and girls live in different worlds and grow, I'm gonna put grow up differently. Men are straightforward. For example, while women's conversations are direct and prefer the use, maybe, of meta messages. Now, when you bring up this for the first time, I would say an indirect way of communication, maybe fostering more involvement in terms of how things are spoken. That might work there. Put a few more things. In the author's example of the conversation, I wouldn't do that here. I wouldn't, you don't need to give any specific details. You could say something like, Tannen uses several examples of dialogue to show how women tend to focus more on how things are said. You might say, whereas men tend to focus on what is said. And that covers, excuse me, that covers maybe why she includes all those examples. Okay, second, the author asks, I don't know that she asks, just say explains. The author explains why women are more likely focused The author explains why women are more likely focused on meta messages than men. And that is because women focus more on relationships between people. These things I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to say these conflicting views that men and women hold and this kind of restates the thesis. That's why I'm putting it. So these conflicting views of talk that men and women hold can lead to misunderstandings. I'm going to not say controversy. You're kind of saying it when you say misunderstandings. Can lead to misunderstandings in the conversations. Maybe 10 and further. Use some type of transition word there. She further explains that women are not interested. So she further explains that women and men may share different interests and topics in talk. For instance, women just want men to listen and understand their stories. However, men often do not recognize the meaning of meta messages because they have lived in different ways than women. Okay, in conclusion, to solve these problems, the author gives some tips. This is good. I like what you put here. In order to solve the problem between men and women, let's put a voice marker in here, right about there. Tannen explains it is good to change their way of talking, try to accept what the other person maybe is doing. The important thing is to understand each other what looks like a bad intention. Put more voice markers in there. Why are we doing this? It frames it more as a summary. Remember, you're not saying this. You want to have maybe 3 or 4 voice markers in every paragraph. So the important thing is understand each other. What looks like a bad intention, contends Tannen, is actually a good intention expressed in a different conversational format. Okay, let's take a look at the whole thing one more time, and I'll give you a score. So Deborah Tannen is a language scholar who says her marriage broke up because of a basic failure of communication. She wants to illustrate why men and women's conversations I'm going to put are cross-cultural communications in long-term relationships. Therefore, she wants to describe some of the characteristics of the different worlds within which they live. First, Tannen tries to explain, I'm just put explains. Tannen explains the differences in conversations between men and women. Men and women have exactly different styles of conversation. She says that boys and girls live in different worlds and grow up differently. Men are straightforward, for example, while women's conversations are more indirect and prefer the use of meta messages, an indirect way of communicating, fostering more involvement in terms of how things are spoken. Tannen uses several examples of dialogue to show how women and men tend to focus more on how things are said, whereas men tend to focus on what is said. Second, the author explains why women are are more likely focused on meta messages than men. That's because women focus more on relationships between people. These conflicting views of talk that men and women hold can lead to misunderstandings in the conversations. She further explains that women and men may share different interests in topics and talk. For instance, women just want men to listen and understand their stories. However, men often do not recognize the meaning about this meta message of, I'm going to put involvement. What am I doing here? I'm using this term because it ties back to the previous sentence. So it says, however, men often do not recognize the meaning of this. This means what we just said, this meta message of involvement, because they have lived in different ways than women. In conclusion, to solve these problems, the author gives some tips. In order to solve the problem between men and women, Tannen explains it is good to change their way of talking and try to accept what the other person is doing. The important thing is to understand each other. What looks like a bad intention, contends Tannen, is actually good intention expressed in a different conversational format. The problem is this sentence that you wrote here, it looks a little bit too similar to what she said in her article. All right? So I think overall, for the most part, I think you have a pretty good summary here. So I'm going to put you at 80 points out of, I'm going to say 85 out of 100. Right? So I made some changes. I added a few things in here. So that's why I'm giving you that score. All right?